Today we're talking about how to cut faster. So let's get into it. Welcome back to the Gem Cutter's Craft. This is Justin K. Prim, and today I want to talk about all things speed. So if you're like me and you've been on your cutting journey, you've gotten good at cutting, you understand the ins and outs of putting down the facets, getting a good polish, and you're pretty much happy with your stone, it might be time to start thinking about speed. Now, for me, when I was starting my professional side of my cutting journey, I really wanted to be able to do a certain amount of stones per day or stones per week. And as I've got further into my journey as a professional cutter, it's become more and more important that I am actually able to cut multiple stones per day if I need to. So in our studio, for Victoria and I, we're typically thinking that we need to be able to cut 2 stones every day if we don't have any other tasks to do. So that means if you're in a 6 to 8 hour workday, you need to be cutting each stone completely from rough to cut or cut to recut in 3 to 4 hours. How is this possible? How can you go through and cut an entire stone, make the shape from rough, do your planning, do your photography, do your cutting and polishing, and finish the whole stone in time to have lunch, and then after lunch, go and do another one? So there's a couple different ways that we can improve our speed. The first and most obvious one is going to be lap sequence. When I got my first faceting machine, I was looking at every type of media available to learn how to cut better. I'm looking at forums, I'm looking at YouTube videos, I'm reading books, and then eventually getting into some social media groups once they popped up. And a lot of the stuff that I first learned from these groups was wrong. So one of the first ways that I started to cut and polish was by taking a bat lap and putting it into a bunch of different rings and doing all of my grits on the same lap. So 600, 1200, 15,000, 60,000, or maybe up to 100,000. And I remember the first stone that I ever cut at home, it was something like a round brilliant or a simple 8-sided design. And I remember I cut all 8 mains on the 600 grit on the bat lap, and the time that it took me to cut those 8 mains, I had one of the Lord of the Rings movies playing in the background, and the entire movie played while I was just cutting in the 8 mains from rough. Now, I didn't know any better at the time, but looking back, this is crazy. It's ridiculous to think that it could take hours to cut just a few facets whenever it should just take hours to cut the entire stone. And the problem was my lap sequence. I was getting information off the internet that, looking back, doesn't really make too much sense for the way that I'm cutting, and I've since improved. So let's talk about lap sequence. How can you be able to go through all of the sequences and get all of the stages of cutting done that you want, hit your final polish, and do it quickly? It's going to come down to how many laps you use, how many times you change, and how many steps you go through. So I'm going to give you my lap sequence just to give you an idea about what a commercial sequence looks like, what a fast sequence looks like. So I am going to go through only 3 laps: preforming, cutting, polishing. That's all I'm ever using on any type of stone, whether it be quartz, moissanite, emeralds, sapphires, whatever. I'm using the same 3 laps on every material. So I'm going to start out with centered laps. So mine are going to look something like this. I've got a 6-inch size, but it's the exact same lap. So I've got 100 grit centered, which is equivalent to like a 360 grit plated lap. So that's my preforming lap. That's all by hand. I'm not really using my faceting machine when I'm using that lap. I'm literally taking the rough and preforming it on this by hand, and then dopping it, doing my fine shaping for my ovals and pears and whatever other shapes I'm going to make. And then if it's a big stone, I might cut my first 8 facets on here because they take a long time to cut in, and then I can cut all. Let's keep using the round brilliant as an example. If I cut all 8 facets in on this, I should be able to preform in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, talking about a round brilliant. Preform the whole stone by hand, then dop it, then spin it. So I've got my girdle, and then cut my table and cut my 8 mains on here in about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to take this off and switch to my 600 centered. So that's my main cutting lap, and all the rest of my facets are going to be cut on there. So I'll recut the table, I'll recut the mains, make sure everything's balanced because it's too hard to balance on the 100 grit. And then cut in my stars, cut in my breaks, cutting for the crown is done. And I'm cutting crown first, so that's how I start the stone. Cutting for the crown is done. Then I'm going to switch to my polishing lap. So my polishing lap looks pretty much exactly like this. I'm using a 6-inch lap, but 6-inch or 8-inch doesn't make a difference. The secret is pre-polish and polish on the same lap. Now, I know some people like to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 steps of pre-polish and polish, but to me this is way too much and it's just unnecessary. If you're coming from a 600 centered, which would be equivalent to, let's say, a 1200 on a plated, or even if you're using topper laps, do all that fine cutting on a 1200, because I think 600 on a topper is not fine enough to go to your pre-polish. Maybe it will, but from the centered, the 600 is good, but I think from the plated or the topper, 1200 is a better jump because you're going to get less little pitting in your facets. But then I'm going to jump to this. I've got 8,000 or 3,000 on the outside ring. I think 8,000 is what I ended up using because 3,000 was a little bit too fast cutting for me. I was over cutting my meat points on that. So the whole point of the outside ring, it's not to get a great polish. It's pre-polish. It's just to take the skin off for the 600 grit. So you've got all your facets cut and your meat points are close. You're going to hit each facet on the outside ring, grow it to the size that it needs to be so your meat points are correct, and all the skin comes off. Now, after you touch that lap, and that should take 2 or 3 seconds total, after you hit that outside ring, your skin's off, your meat points are to where they're supposed to be. Maybe there's still scratches on it. No problem, no big deal, doesn't make a difference. The outside ring, the pre-polish, is not for getting scratches off, it's for getting the skin off. Then, after 3 or 4 seconds, or maybe a little bit longer if you're cutting a quartz or something that's not polishing very well, but typically, if I'm cutting a stone like a garnet or an aquamarine that doesn't really give me any problems, 2 or 3 seconds on the outside ring, and then I wipe it off and I immediately jump to the inside ring, which is my 60,000 grit. That's my final polish. And 2 or 3 seconds on there should take out all the scratches. If it doesn't take out all the scratches, I'm going to move to a different part of the lap, and because the diamond's moving in a different direction. So usually by moving between, let's say, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 1 o'clock, I can get all the scratches out that I need to by working my stone in that way. Now, if you're on a mass machine, it's a little bit trickier to move the stone around the lap, but you should be able to go between, let's say, 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock without moving the mass, which is easy. And in that way, the diamond's moving up or down depending on which way you're rotating the lap. So I'm going from 600 grit to a few seconds on 8,000, a few seconds on 60,000, wipe it off, go to the next facet. There's no lap changing between pre-polish and polish, and there's no going back and finding your facet. So that means less indexing, less chances of making a mistake, less changing the lap, which already is going to save you a couple of minutes. And when all that's said and done, you've got only 3 laps, which means less laps that you need, and less changes, which means more efficient, more time saving, less chance to make mistakes. And this is one way that you can really speed up your time. If you're going from a 1200 grit cutting lap to 3,000 to 8,000 to 14,000 to 60,000 to 100,000 and maybe even to 200,000, this is not necessary. It's literally wasting time because I'm going to get the same finish that you're getting with only these 3 laps and only these 4 steps. So if you're going through an extensive lap sequence, I would recommend try and pull a couple of those out. Really, you only need 1 pre-polish and 1 polish. You're not really getting a benefit by going through all these extra steps, in my opinion. I mean, you might disagree, but that's my experience so far. And see if you can increase your time by just reducing the number of steps, reducing the number of times you have to touch each facet to a lap. And then if you feel like trying to do a dual band system like this, you can do it on any type of lap. Gearloose has some polishing laps that have sectioned off areas of different materials like the dominatrix or the red wing, but I've done this with every one of my laps. This lap is not in 2 rings. It's 1 piece of metal that I've just basically sharpied in a ring with a marker and made into 2 rings. All my laps are set up like this. I've got a lead lap like this, I've got a bat lap like this, I've got a copper lap like this, I've got a zinc lap like this. Every material that I might want in my studio, I'm going through the same sequences. And whether I'm doing quartz or sapphire, moissanite or whatever, I'm using the same thing on every step. Now there is another way of increasing your time, and I'm going to make another separate video for this, but it has to do with how you're understanding your index gears, understanding the geometry that's inside of the arrangement of your numbers, and then being able to understand that geometry so you don't have to go through your diagram and read number by number by number and following the numbers. You can literally look at your index gear and understand how all of the geometry maps out on the index, and you can cut your entire round brilliant or whatever design it may be and never ever look at the index numbers on your design. But that is for another video. If you've been enjoying my channel and enjoying the articles and videos that I've been putting out over the years, then I would ask you to consider supporting me on Patreon. Patreon is a way that you can donate a couple dollars to me each month to help support the channel and keep all these videos coming for free. Also this year, I've got some really cool, interesting stuff coming to the Patreon, including a new podcast. I just got back from Tucson and I've got about 10 podcasts recorded and ready to edit, and I'm hopefully going to get these up in the next month or two, and every couple of weeks a new podcast is going to be coming up on the Patreon. So if you want to hear interviews from gem cutters, jewelers, gemologists, and all kinds of other people in the trade talking about the concept of cutting, find me over on Patreon. There's a link in the description down below. Check me there. And thank you so much to all my Patreon subscribers. Here's just a few of the names. And if you want to see your name up on the next video, up on my subscriber list, find me on Patreon and subscribe to me over there. This has been Justin K. Prim with the Gem Cutter's Craft. I'll see you next time right here. Until then, happy Valentine's Day.